Thank you very much, and thank you to the library. I should note for the television audience at C-SPAN 2 and the radio audience on WCSP-FM here in Washington and on Sirius XM all across the country, it's a packed house here today, so thank you all for coming out. There'll be an opportunity for some of you to ask questions, and of course an opportunity to hear from our two authors who have touched on in their revelatory works some issues that are incredibly important to our national conversation. We have right here in this city President Trump surging federal law enforcement, sending in the National Guard, cleaning out homeless encampments. We have the president vowing to pursue the death penalty here in Washington, D.C. We'll talk about all these issues. I have a stack of questions you'll ask some yourselves, but first I want to turn to our two authors. Tell us about your books. Brian Goldstone, let's start with you. Tell us about There Is No Place for Us.
It's wonderful to be with you. So my book, There Is No Place for Us, it is premised on a discovery that I made around 2018, 2019, that in cities across America right now, it's no exaggeration to say that a low-wage job is homelessness waiting to happen. That millions of people, not hundreds of thousands, but millions of people in this country right now are one missed paycheck, one rent hike, one lapsed week of child care, one family emergency away from not falling into homelessness, but being pushed into homelessness, because I think this is systematic. And so my book follows 5 families in Atlanta, Georgia, where I live with my family. In the book, it covers about 2 years in these families' lives. The reporting itself went for 5+ years. And it kind of, I tried, drawing on my background as an anthropologist, I tried to just immerse myself as much as humanly possible in the day-to-day lives of these families who, headed by parents who are working and working and working some more. They're working not just one job, but in some cases several jobs at once. Mind you, jobs that whose wages are not only ridiculously low, not nearly enough to afford a place to live, but that also don't offer basic benefits like sick leave or health insurance. And they're working and working some more, and it's not enough to just obtain this most basic human necessity, a roof overhead. So the book follows them in their struggle to get housing, and it tries to show all of the interlocking systems that at every turn in their journey are just militating actively against their stability.
People trapped in a cycle. We'll talk,
very much.
We'll talk all about it. Yeah. Gianna Tommoni, tell us about your work to create The Volunteer. You were, like me, you're a broadcaster.
Yes. First, I just want to say I can't think of a more urgent and important story than Brian's book. Thank you for writing it. I know it was an incredible feat, not an easy one. It's an honor to be here with both of you, and thank you all for coming out. So I was working on a documentary program, Vice on HBO, and I pitched a story, and you'd find this in the first few pages of the book, about the death penalty. And I said, in 6 seasons, how have we not covered this? And HBO came back and said, you can do it if you get an interview in person with a death row inmate. That proved a difficult endeavor, but the person we ended up finding is the protagonist in this book. And I was interested in his story for a couple reasons. One, he was just sort of a fascinating person. Originally I was looking for an innocence story, someone who would represent many of the issues with the death penalty in our country. For several reasons, I didn't get to talk to the person I wanted to, sort of a sympathetic person on death row. Instead, I found someone completely unsympathetic, which ended up being kind of the perfect person to represent the face of this broken system in America. He volunteered for execution, hence the title, The Volunteer, and this is his journey trying to get executed in America, which is actually, for many people, more difficult than you might think. It's not a pro-death penalty story. It's not an anti-death penalty story. It's a deep investigation into a broken system. And I alternate chapters between Scott Dozier's story from birth until death, which is quite a journey, and then the broader story of the death penalty in America.
By the numbers, capital punishment is the law in 27 states and at the federal level. Do you know how many prisoners have been condemned to die in the United States?
So there are just over 2,000 death row inmates on the state level in the US. There are 3 on the federal death row. That number based on what President Trump is saying, is about to grow. But then what he has also signaled, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more later, is that he will then clear death row because he is saying that he is going to expedite these executions.
There were last year 37 more people on death row. President Biden commuted those sentences in his final weeks in office. How many of the 2,000, give or take, will actually be put to death? What does your reporting tell you?
So this is a stunning data set that I stumbled upon in my reporting, which is that 49.9% of death sentences will be overturned. Half of death sentences in our country are not strong enough to bear the appeals process. So that gives you a sense of how broken these prosecutions are, how weak these cases are. If 50% of them can be overturned, only 15% of people on death row will ever actually be executed, 15%. And yet, we will pay hundreds of thousands, if not millions of more dollars per death sentence, right? Even though they're not being carried out. So there are certainly a lot of humanitarian arguments that I get at in this book. But if you just look at the data, the death penalty is not working in our country.
Brian, how many people in this country are experiencing homelessness?
So every year, volunteers across the country fan out to conduct what's called the point-in-time count. That's the federal homeless census that is mandated by HUD. And according to that homeless census, roughly 770,000 people are unhoused right now in this country. It's important to note that that is the highest number on record since this count first began to be conducted. And this most recent count broke the previous year's record, which was itself a record. So officially, we are looking at just an unprecedented surge in homelessness in this country. But I was shocked to discover when I began reporting this book that as bad as the official numbers are, the reality is exponentially worse, that there's this entire world of homelessness that is out of sight, that is invisible. And in that world, it is overwhelmingly filled with families with children. It's overwhelmingly filled with working people. But what we see on the street, again, as bad as what we see on the street is, and it is a crisis, the tents really are just the tip of the iceberg. And in many ways, my book is trying to immerse readers in that immense iceberg that is under the water's surface. To put a number on it, by cobbling together different data sources, I show that the true number of people who are homeless right now in this country is roughly 6 times greater than the official count.
Wow.
So we're talking closer to 4 million men, women, and children. Just in Georgia alone, where I live, if you were to gather all of the men, women, and children in one place who are excluded from the official count, who literally don't count, who have been written out of the story that we have told ourselves about homelessness in this country, if you were to gather them in one place just in Georgia, they would fill the Braves Stadium, Truist Park, 3 times over. And if you were to walk those seats, you would see probably half of them would be children. And so it's a mammoth crisis, and in part, the reason why the official number is so out of sync with that larger number that I mentioned is because when that homeless count is conducted, only those who are living on the street or in designated homeless shelters are counted. Everyone else, families crowded into apartments with others, people living in their cars, people living in these squalid extended stay hotels. And that's a really important site in my book because these hotels are proliferating across the country. They're basically extremely profitable homeless shelters. And all of the people living in all of those different places are excluded from that count.
Your book goes into extraordinary detail as to the conditions at these extended stay hotels. And you could think of, perhaps places where they have nice places where they have kitchenettes and maybe even 2 bedrooms. What are you talking about when you talk about extended stay hotels?
Yeah, you know, as a resident of Atlanta, I would drive by these hotels all the time. I mean, when people hear extended stay hotel, sometimes they think of like a Residence Inn or a Homewood Studios, a place where a traveling nurse might stay or a business person on
Corporate apartments.
Yes, exactly. What we're talking about here are extended stay hotels on the budget or economy end of the spectrum. Where the conditions are really, I mean, across the board, and I was in many of these hotels. I spent hours and hours and hours in these hotels. Slum conditions, conditions that when I said they're extremely profitable homeless shelters would not get away with conditions like these. Dripping ceilings, walls caving in, rodents, cockroaches, you name it. But what is truly perverse is these places are often double or even triple as much per month than an apartment would cost. And the reason you have all these families living in these hotels is because they have been barred from the formal housing market. They belong to a credit underclass where this 3-digit number, your credit score, often destroyed by an eviction on your record, or medical debt, or student debt, or all the other debt that we have come up with in this country. Their credit score is destroyed, and this 3-digit number that has come to determine whether scores of people in this country have access to something as basic as a place to live, it is destroyed, and they go to these places because it's the only place they can go. They don't ask for a credit score when you check in. All they ask is that you pay your rent, not monthly, but weekly. And if you're just a day late, they will lock you out. There are families who have the hotel address on their driver's license because that is how long they've been there. School buses come to pick up kids who have been living there, not for months, but years. And, you know, during the pandemic, Wall Street, seeing how lucrative this insecurity could be, that these places really are proliferating amid a historic affordable housing crisis, Blackstone and Starwood Capital, 2 private equity giants, they bought Extended Stay America, the largest chain of budget extended stays, where one of the families in my book lives. They bought that for $6 billion because, you know, to flip the James Baldwin line on its head, you know, about how extremely expensive it is to be poor in America, what these families' journeys demonstrate is the flip side, how extremely profitable all of this precarity has become for some.
And because they're hotels and not apartments, there are certain regulations that might not apply.
The only thing worse than being a tenant in America is not even counting as a tenant, because the families living in these hotels, they don't even have the minimal tenant protections of, like, if you're late on your rent, the landlord has to go through the courts to evict you. For these families, you're just locked out. So the only thing worse than being a tenant is not, and conversely, the only thing worse than being homeless in America is not counting as homeless. So these families are in this kind of semi-permanent limbo where they are locked out of homeless assistance because they aren't defined as homeless by HUD, and they are exposed to the worst kinds of predatory behavior, exploitative behavior, because they don't even have these minimal tenant protections.
Both of your books get into systemic societal problems. I want to go back to Gianna because your book, The Volunteer, you alluded to this, you write about a man who wanted to be put to death. Talk about Scott Dozier, explain to the audience what he did that landed him on death row.
So Scott Dozier grew up in a middle-class family in the American West. His family moved every couple years because of his dad's job. At some point, you know, he kind of got off path, got into drug dealing and using and manufacturing. He found his way to death row because he was convicted in 2 jury trials in 2 separate states of murder. In one of the cases, his capital case in Nevada, he was convicted not only of murder, but of dismembering the body. I get into the trials, I get into the evidence. In both cases, I think it's worth and fair to mention that they were both based on circumstantial evidence, no DNA evidence, circumstantial evidence where, for the most part, those who were testifying against him got deals themselves. So he had these brutal crimes that he committed. He was someone who lived, you know, a fast life on the outside. He had this sort of addiction to stimulation and had this insatiable adrenaline. And so once he found his way to death row, you know, he was locked in a 9-foot by 5-foot cage, and he was in his 40s. And he just looked around and said, no way. this is worse than execution, and I don't care how brutal the execution is. I don't even care what the method is. And even in the court proceedings, he said as much. His own defense attorneys were saying, look, you could literally be tortured to death with this execution method, with these drugs that they're using. And he said, I don't care, I'm not getting off that effing table. So he was just done. He was done with the idea of having to live the rest of his life in what is effectively a cage, which I think brings up a really interesting point. We think of the death penalty and execution as the worst possible punishment for a violent offender. Well, what about incarceration in America, right? Maybe that's actually worse than execution. And for some people, like Scott Dozier, it was.
We are talking with two journalists who have written about a variety of topics, but in any topic you cover, one of the hardest things for any journalist to do is to establish a trust relationship with your sources. Gianna, you're reaching out to Scott Dozier, hoping he responds. How do you develop a trust relationship with a man whom you haven't yet met?
We might have some audio issues here. Oh, it came back. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Can you
repeat the question? I apologize. My question was, as journalists, we have to develop source relationships and get sources to trust us in order to tell them tell us anything so we can tell you. How do you develop, Gianna, a source relationship with a man whom is behind bars you haven't met?
So, in the case of Scott Dozier, and I've interviewed a lot of sort of controversial and hard to reach figures and those who have been committed of brutal crimes, ISIS fighters, cartel hitmen in Mexico, and so on. Scott Dozier was easier than I thought it would be. I found out about his execution, that it was going to be in 2 weeks, and I wrote him a letter, overnighted it to his prison in Nevada, and as soon as he received it, he called me. And I answered the phone, and he was kind of a guy that relied on dark humor to get his point across. I was working for a company called Vice. Some of you may know this company. I would say the sort of shorthand reputation around this company, mostly in the years before I joined, was that it was this boys' club that only kind of reported on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And then it transitioned into this kind of amazing place for journalism that won 1 trillion Emmys and Peabodys and Pulitzers and all the rest of it. Scott Dozier subscribed to the old Vice. And so I answered the phone. I saw that it was from Ely, Nevada, and I thought, oh my God, this guy's actually calling me. And I answered, and there he is on death row, and he said, hey, Gianna, it's Scott, like as if we were high school friends. I was like, hi, Scott, thank you for calling. And he's like, first thing, I just got to tell you, you guys are such effing sellouts. I used to subscribe to Vice when you were actually reporting on cool SHIT, and now you guys are a bunch of sellouts reporting on human rights and blah, blah. And I was, and so I couldn't help but laugh, And in those conversations, I'm usually guarded and, professional as a journalist. But in this moment, I was sort of like, you gotta be kidding me that this is he's barely even, introduced himself and he's already going down this analysis of my company. But that set the tone, I think, for that relationship, which I would say, was a professional relationship throughout, but one in which I was really challenged as a journalist and as a human. As I said, I found him to be completely unsympathetic and the clear sort of bad guy when we first met. And months into knowing him, things started to change. And I started to see how the state was treating him and mistreating him and putting him into solitary confinement for, not very good reason, and the impact that was having on him and his family. And I started to see, him go from the bad guy to the victim and the state becoming the bad guy. And I had to really question my role as a journalist and my role as a human and what comes first. And I experienced a lot of sort of self-doubt, and it's in the book. I really try to be vulnerable in the book and explain that, it can be hard to figure out where the line is, between journalist and just compassionate person seeing someone suffering in front of you. I know you've probably dealt with those internal conflicts.
I just want to say, I love how in your book, how forthright you are about your own kind of turmoil around this, even the process of hoping that you could find someone more sympathetic and they're not there, and just your because often we just don't see that as readers. And I just thought it was incredibly brave of you to even go there and to kind of open that Pandora's box.
Yeah. It doesn't make me look good, to be fair, for most of the book. But I hope that you can see why I chose to be as sort of brutally honest as I was.
Ryan, you're also immersive in your reporting as you get us readers into these homes with these people that they're being sheltered in. Talk about how you developed a trust relationship with these 5 different families, some of them single women with children. I imagine it might have been difficult at first. I mean, you know, for our radio audience, Brian Goldstone, you are a white male. You know, what was it?
I am indeed.
Right. Was it difficult for you to walk into some of these spaces and earn trust right away?
Yes, it was. It was. I've been asked since the book came out, you know, how did you pick the 5 families who you end up following in this book? And I have to kind of chuckle because it was much more a question of like, who is going to allow me into their world, into their lives in such a way that readers will feel in this visceral way, not just the superficial details of being homeless and struggling in this way and the numbers don't add up, but to feel in a visceral way what it's like for parents, for their kids, you know, when this basic necessity is always out of reach. That's what I was going for, and it required what in retrospect feels like a miraculous degree of trust. And you know, I should say that the genesis for this book was actually a magazine story that I wrote for the New Republic following one family over a period of about 7 months. And while I was reporting that story, one of my either great virtues or great vices as a journalist is, and again, kind of coming from my background as an anthropologist, is spending what my editors and journalist friends think is just a ridiculous amount of time on a story. You know, even after I filed the story for the New Republic, I was continuing to go to the food pantries, go to church, go just be with this family. And as I was doing that, I was meeting all of these other families and individuals who are struggling with the same thing. One thing I will say about a journalist or a researcher who wants to write about the rise of the working homeless in America, unlike some topics where you're a journalist and you have the topic and you're struggling to find the people who will carry that story, there is no shortage of people who fit that category. And so there were a lot of people who I was meeting, and yeah, you know, at the beginning I was like, I wanted to check certain demographic boxes. I wanted to have kind of a plurality of people who I was following so that they would represent all the different, you know, facets of who might experience this, the white working class family. But in Atlanta, it's important to say that even though the city is no longer majority black, it's about 47% black at the moment, an astonishing 93% of families who are experiencing homelessness in Atlanta are black. So in some ways, to like get that demographic plurality wouldn't have been true. It wouldn't have been honest. And so when I met some of the families through reporting that story. One family, the way I first ended up at this extended stay hotel called Efficiency Lodge was a caseworker who I met who worked at a church, a food pantry, called me one night in 2019, and she was like, I checked a family into one of these hotels, and I'm supposed to bring them food, but my car broke down. Are you able to get over there? And it was like 9:30 on a Friday night, and I was like, sure, I'll go there. And I stopped at Little Caesars and brought a bunch of pizzas to this hotel, and Michelle met me in the parking lot, and she said, would you be able to bring toiletries or personal items tomorrow? Because they had lost everything in an eviction, and I was like, sure. So I showed up the next day, I met the hotel manager, and then before I knew it, you know, I did with each family who I met, like, I made it very clear what my project, like what my purpose was. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but it felt important to say, you know, this is what, I want people to know what it's like to be you. I want them to feel what it's like to be you. And part of that is not manipulating the circumstances that have dictated what it's like to be you right now. And so that meant, like, I can't give you big sums of money and things like, and so that's a big, big topic. But I think there was some trust that was established even with that, like me being clear, like this is what I want people to see what it's like. And for them, like part of their anguish was not just the material circumstances, it was at best being invisible, not being acknowledged, their struggle, their precarity, but at worst, being condemned, being judged, being pathologized by an entire society or by people in their life. Like, if you're struggling this way, it must be your fault. And so part of why they trusted me to begin with, I think, was because I wasn't just like, I want to write about homelessness. It was, I want to write about the systems that have put you here. And they felt that. And so, yeah, but it was an ongoing journey. I mean, I told them from the beginning, like, you've never worked with a journalist before, so we're not just doing like this one-time consent and then 5 years later the book is published. Like they didn't know what they were consenting to. So I was constantly checking in with them and saying, look, if there's anything you're telling me or that I'm witnessing that you don't want known publicly, let's talk about it. There is nothing set in stone. And then when the whole book was done, I sat down with each of them and went through their whole story as recorded in the book and gave them the chance. It was crushing to go through some of this. There was a lot of tears. But I said, if there's anything you don't want here, let's talk about it. And none of them asked, can't hear? The whole answer? Okay, because I'm like, please don't make me say all of that again.
See if my mic is on? No? Scream real loud. I'm sorry.
I think C-SPAN, okay.
And we're back.
I think maybe I said something so controversial that C-SPAN but to their credit, if that's even the way to put it, after going through all of their stories one by one as recorded in the book, and after all the tears and as devastating as it was for all of us to revisit some of those moments and those details recorded in the book, none of them asked for any changes, and they were just like, this is what happened, this is the reality, and there's no words for what that meant to me.
I want to dive a bit deeper into some of the systemic things you write about in tremendous detail. It's extremely revelatory. You talk about gentrification. You describe it sort of as a balloon being squeezed from one end. People are priced out of a particular neighborhood but have to go somewhere else. You talk about the impact on the housing supply and the stumbling blocks that are set up systematically in people's way. Talk about the difficulties that people, in your experience, have taking advantage of some of the safety net programs. For example, Section 8 housing. Explain why it was so difficult for one of your characters to use a Section 8 voucher in Atlanta.
Yeah, so one of the people in the book, her name is Britt, and the title of the book actually comes from Britt. I'll get to that. But through Britt's own individual story, her own trajectory, you can kind of tell the story of housing policy in America, because when Britt was born, her family was living in public housing. Atlanta was actually the first city in the country to build public housing. Techwood Homes was the first housing project. And during the 90s and 2000s, around the time Britt was a child, Atlanta became the first city in the country to begin demolishing all of its public housing in favor of this kind of neoliberal experiment in saying to the private market, please, like, instead of the government, one of Reagan's deputies said the federal government is getting out of the housing business, period. And so this was really an experiment in saying to the private market, please, now that we're out of the housing business, we'll pay you to house poor and working class people in this country who can't afford market rents. Please, please, we'll try to incentivize you. But of course, that private market can decide if landlords can decide, I do want to rent to you or I don't want to rent to you. I do want to take the subsidy, I don't want to take the subsidy. So Britt, her family was displaced when those housing projects began to be demolished. And as an adult, when the book opened, she's working at the Atlanta airport, the pride and joy of Atlanta's economy. She is working at an eatery called Low Country, a southern food place. And she and her children are doubled up with her great-grandmother in her apartment, sleeping in the living room. Britt has just gotten off the voucher waiting list. So I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but Section 8 vouchers, which are just vital subsidies, because if you can get one, you only are responsible for paying 30% of your income toward the rent. This voucher pays the landlord the rest. And the way you get a voucher is you enter a lottery. And the fact that we even use the word lottery in relation to this essential human need tells us something about what we've allowed housing to become in America. But when these lotteries open, sometimes once every decade, tens of thousands of residents enter the lottery. Britt was lucky enough to win the lottery. She got on the waiting list. 2 years later, when the book opened, she gets off the waiting list. And as we follow her journey, tragically, she ends up losing this voucher, which for her is like the only way that she is going to house her kids in the city of her birth, a city where her family roots go back 5 generations. The only way is through this voucher, and she ends up losing it because not a single landlord will rent to her. Because in hot rental markets, and this gets to, you mentioned gentrification, these vouchers in hot rental markets are much less appealing or lucrative for landlords because there's so much competition for a single apartment. So why would I take this rent subsidy where there are rents that are set at a certain level and where I have to pass certain safety inspections and things like that when I can jack up rents at will for just an unassisted tenant, as they're called. And of course, there's also a lot of racism baked into this, stigma around those people who have vouchers. But it's up to the landlord to take them. And in gentrifying cities, gentrifying neighborhoods of cities, you see fewer and fewer landlords who are willing to take these vouchers. And in Atlanta, the year that Britt lost her voucher, there were something like 1,600 vouchers issued to families that year in Atlanta, and about 1,100 expired because some people couldn't use them. They couldn't find a landlord who would take them, and that is mirrored and replicated across the country. About 40% of all vouchers are lost because families can't use them. So that is what that program looks like. Britt then, I've already talked a long time, but she then ends up in what's called a low-income housing tax credit apartment. LIHTC, for those in the world of housing policy. And if a voucher is like the nation's primary way of subsidizing rents for tenants, the LIHTC program is the primary means of providing housing, where the property itself is subsidized. And Britt ends up in one of these apartments where her rent isn't as low as it would have been with the voucher, but she's still so grateful to have ended up in this apartment. And as I'm following her, everyone thought this was a tax credit apartment where she could be assured of stable housing, which was not luxurious by any means, no dishwasher, et cetera, but it was a home where they could be assured at least until 2028 that they would have a place to live, because that's when the affordability requirements were expiring. But come to find out, her landlord, the owner of this property, exploited a kind of loophole in the LIHTC program called qualified contract and was able to sell this property to a luxury developer. The property was near the Beltline, which is like the High Line in New York on steroids. It's like whatever the Beltline touches, property values are skyrocketing, boutique hotels, yoga studios, all the sort of recognizable markers of revitalization and gentrification, and all of the residents of Gladstone Apartments, where Britt was living, were informed during the pandemic, you have to find another place to live. Everyone there became homeless. Many people went to these hotels. Many people went to shelters. And so coming back to the title, There Is No Place for Us, that is what Britt spoke at the end of the book, returning to the neighborhood where she grew up, that is now beautiful, where there are cafes and where there's all these new amenities and green space. And she looks around and she says, wow, this place is really nice, but for me and my kids, there's no place for us here. And that is not just an Atlanta title, that is a Washington, D.C. title, that is a Baltimore title, that is a Nashville, Charlotte, Chicago, New York, L.A., San Francisco title. It is increasingly an American title.
What the reader learns from your book, Brian, is just how these systemic problems really do create the societal problem that we have. Gianna, I want to ask you about Scott Dozier, and I think you may have mentioned this, that he attracted your attention because he was supposed to be the first inmate to be put to death with the use of fentanyl.
Yes.
What? Talk about the difficulty for state executioners in terms of coming into drugs that are meant to be used to put these inmates to death, and how this led to what you wrote about in the book.
It has been incredibly difficult for states to carry out the death penalty using lethal injection because, long story short, drug companies have said, unsurprisingly, we prefer that our drugs are not used for executions. We want to be the company that creates the, vaccine miracle, not the drug that's used to, kill our own citizens. And so state governments have had to be creative, in some cases fraudulent, with the way that they get these drugs. So they've gone overseas. They go to India. They go to the UK. They go to China to find drugs that they can buy and illegally import to the United States, which is what they've done for years. So they will import mass amounts of prescription drugs that in overdose amounts can kill people. What has happened is that the DEA has confiscated the drugs at the border, the FDA has held them and then released them, but these scenes unfold in our country, very much in our lifetime, in modern times, that kind of feel like scenes out of Breaking Bad or Narcos, except it's not cartels that are drug dealing, it's our own government officials. And it's sort of astonishing as you see kind of how kind of criminal these actions are by a government that's trying to kill criminals. It all feels a little bit ironic once you spell it out in plain language. And so what they've done is they've adapted their protocols. So instead of using the standard 3-drug protocol that this method was designed to do, they will bring in fentanyl, or they'll bring in a drug, pentobarbital, or propofol, or just whatever drug they can get their hands on. And it's actually that simple. I did a bunch of FOIA requests. That's the Freedom of Information Act. So I got all the internal documents. I got text messages and emails between state officials. So I'm actually able, and this is in the book, to see the text messages between the head of the prison chief, the head of the prison system in Nevada, texting the head of pharmacy in the state. And he's saying like, hey, do you think you can get some of this drug? And she's like, would you take this drug? And he's like, he's basically saying, I'll take anything. And that's what ended up happening in Nevada, is they got what they could get. And what's happening now in the last year or so since I wrote this book is that now they're continuing to adapt these methods. So in some cases and this is in the book, but bringing back methods of old, the electric chair, the firing squad. In some cases, inmates know how torturous lethal injection can be, and I explain why. It's not actually just somebody falling asleep on a gurney. But they're voluntarily choosing the electric chair over lethal injection, which is kind of astonishing. But what is also happening is that other methods are coming into the fold. So nitrogen gas, for instance, has been used in Alabama more than once, and other states are starting to adopt it. But some states, a small number of states, will not give up. They are stubborn, they are headstrong about continuing to want to carry out this practice, despite how broken the system is.
One of the through lines in these two books is that the characters, in some respects, are both driven to madness. Can you talk, Gianna, about the impact that the prison system had on your subject, Scott Dozier?
Yes. So Scott Dozier, as I mentioned, he was volunteering for execution. He was literally fighting the state to execute him, and they couldn't find a way to do it. They kept getting caught up in the courts, so his execution was stayed, and then they got the drugs, and then it stayed again because a drug company sues the state. What ends up happening is that when the execution is stayed the second time, the state puts him into solitary confinement. And they have medical language for it, suicide watch, and then mental health observation. But basically, when you hear it described in the book, and I give the official language and then I give what it looks like, and you can make your own assessment, but it is, according to the World Medical Association, it is solitary confinement. And so he is, effectively being punished for the state's inability to carry out his execution. Some months pass, several things transpire in his story, but he's put into solitary confinement again, and unlawfully based on the state's own protocols. And they keep him there for weeks without access to his family, without access to his lawyers. He, at one point, convinces a young man who's a correctional officer there to slip him the phone, and he calls me in the middle of the night, and I hear how broken he is. But I watch as this person completely degrades. And then I talk to people on the inside who are not just hearing him degrade as I am, but are watching him, completely break down, losing muscle mass. He's growing his hair out. He's just unrecognizable. And his time in solitary confinement eventually leads to his end. He ends up, I think I'll just give away the ending unless there's anyone who would prefer that I didn't. He eventually ends up taking his own life. And a lot of our conversations in the days and weeks before he dies, he's telling me as much. And he's using language as clear as, the state has driven me to do this. If the state did not put me in solitary confinement, I would not be, contemplating suicide. He tells me the story in clear language in the days leading up to his death. And at some point, when I started writing the book, which was a couple years after he died, and I was lining up timelines, and I was reading the transcripts of our conversation, and I was looking at the phone logs of when I was talking to the other death row inmates, and I pieced everything together, and what I write in the book is that I realized that I think I unintentionally was having a hand in his pursuit of death. And, as a journalist, as a person, that was hard to realize, and that was kind of an emotional experience in this book. He wanted to die, but still, to be unintentionally aiding someone in their pursuit of death is sort of a heavy thing to carry. But when I talked to his parents after he died, they both said he made it. He made it. He was subjected to, I think what his mom said was worse than what many prisoners of war are subjected to. He finally reached what he was seeking.
You also, Gianna, write stirringly about the impact that executions had on an executioner. Talk about that.
So this is something that is only just starting to be talked about. Of course, there's a lot of media that focuses on the incarcerated folks and on the victims, but the people carrying out these executions or in any way touching the process, in a lot of cases are volunteers, in some cases are not. Regardless, these people are actually facing some pretty debilitating symptoms of trauma. This is actually what I think is one of the most powerful and emotional chapters, just hearing about the firsthand experience of a warden, for instance, who oversees an execution in Florida, which goes horribly wrong. It's an electric chair execution, and in the words of the warden, they ended up not electrocuting this person to death, but burning this person to death. A flame shoots toward the warden's face, and he can smell the person's skin burning before him. And it's someone who he sort of unintentionally had built a relationship with. And he talks about how, the flesh of this person's skin, the other inmates could then smell it. I mean, it's horrific detail, which, by the way, the whole book is not that graphic. But in some of these chapters, I did feel it was important to say, in clear language what was happening. But then this warden tells me what he experienced in the aftermath of overseeing all of these executions. And he became an alcoholic. He had a big bottle of booze in his desk every day. He would go to sleep at night, and he said as soon as he fell asleep, all of the inmates would visit him in his room. And they would walk into his room, and they would sit at the foot of the bed, and they would stare at him. And as he said, they didn't have to say anything because he knew what they were thinking. We're talking about a pro-death penalty, straight ticket Republican, warden, state official. And he's saying these things. And as a result, he's now become anti-death penalty. He's tried to have conversations with Governor Ron DeSantis But he says that there's a sickness in our society because anytime they needed a volunteer to carry out an execution, he received not hundreds, but thousands of letters from people saying, I'd be happy to do it for free.
Ryan Goldstone, you write about the impact of the cycle of despair that the people who you write about are in. Can you talk about the impact on their mental health?
I think that was one of the hardest things to witness through this process was, when the book opens, Michelle is wearing a Santa hat and making Christmas Eve dinner for her kids. The chapter ends with her and her kids and her fiance making a gingerbread house. And by the end of the book, Michelle is estranged from her kids. She's in the throes of alcoholism. She's sleeping in the MARTA station. And to see how utterly preventable that was anyone walking by Michelle in that moment would see someone who is ostensibly homeless because they are addicted to substances or they're dealing with mental health issues. What we don't see is that homelessness is just as often a cause of mental health issues and addiction, trying to self-medicate in any way you can, as it is a consequence of it. And I think that is one of the most striking things that I observed was how just to see people in real time, like almost disintegrating before your eyes, children exposed to what public health researchers refer to as toxic stress, just acute anxiety, acute depression, not knowing when your parents pick you up from school, where are you going to be staying tonight? Where am I going to be staying tomorrow night? Parents terrified in their cars at night that, sleeping in the Walmart parking lot, that a cop will knock on their window and then call Child Protective Services because in Georgia, as in many states in this country, about 20% at least of child removals are the direct result of what is officially categorized as inadequate housing. So parents are terrified, and the effect that takes, and how, what the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the organized abandonment that these families are living under, and to see how it could have been prevented, to see how just the tiniest interventions, could have prevented this suffering, and to know that in the richest nation on earth, families are suffering in this way and struggling in this way for such unnecessary and preventable reasons. It was devastating to witness that. At one point, Kara, at the end of the book, she's finally gotten to the point where, okay, I'm ready to talk to a therapist. She had this stigma. She grew up with a stigma around therapy, like that means you're mental, as she put it. She finally got over that, and she was like, I need to talk to someone. And I had to sit there and watch as she called the Medicaid phone number for Georgia and was told that her form of state-subsidized insurance only covered contraception, sterilization, and STD treatment. Because Georgia was one of the states that didn't expand Medicaid. And to see right now how Medicaid is under attack and how what Kara experienced in that moment will potentially be multiplied across the country is a lot.
We're getting near the end of the hour. I want to ask if anyone is interested in asking a question, please come forward to the microphones as we wait for that. Picking up on that point about the law in Georgia, why did you find that the families you profiled have, for whatever reason, chosen not to leave that state? I mean, the laws are written, as you report, in such a way that it's really not favorable to renters at all in the state of Georgia. Why haven't they just picked up and moved away?
Yeah, a question that I get a lot is not only why don't they move, but like why don't they go somewhere more affordable, right? Because all of these families and all of their neighbors in these hotels and all of the other families sleeping in the parking lot beside of them, they're all living under this brutal arithmetic where what they're earning at their jobs is not nearly enough to keep up with these skyrocketing rents. That chasm is what defines their existence. And so people say, well, go somewhere cheaper. But Atlanta was supposed to be that cheaper place. Atlanta was supposed to be the place where you go when you can't afford Chicago or New York or San San Francisco or DC, and one of the families leaves DC, and they go to Atlanta seeking opportunity, and they realize they jump from the frying pan into the fire. Right now in America, there isn't a single state, city, or metro area where a full-time worker earning the local minimum wage, which is often higher than the federal minimum wage, which hasn't been raised in, I believe, 16 years, where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And there's 7 counties in the US where they can afford a 1-bedroom apartment. So again, There Is No Place for Us is an American title.
We have several people lined up, so let's just go quickly and get in as many as we can.
Hi, my name is Shelby. I actually oversee our day drop-in centers and our homeless encampment outreach programs for Delaware. So I just appreciate you being very boots on the ground. It's really hard work to do. But I'm wondering if there's a personal experience that you have or a personal attachment that got you to highlight this issue, or was it just something you saw that needed to be highlighted?
Thank you for asking, because my wife is here, and it was actually my wife who spurred me to write about this. My wife is a nurse practitioner. She's more recently become a therapist, but when I first started this, she was working as a nurse practitioner at a community health center called Mercy Care, an incredible organization in Atlanta, and she started to notice this trend where her patients were working at Amazon warehouses. They were driving for Uber and Lyft. They were in caregiving positions, daycare workers, home health aides. One person was even designing movie sets, because Georgia's very proud of its burgeoning, or not burgeoning, like they call it Yollywood, a very unfortunate name. But was even designing movie sets. And when they were finishing their shifts, they weren't going to an apartment, they told Elaine, my wife. They were going to shelters, if there were any shelters of it. One person was sleeping in a tent on the street. They were going to these hotels. And so that's really what got me started on this, was this shock, that, in America, there's this implicit contract that if you just work hard enough, if you just clock enough hours, you might not make it rich, you might not be able to buy a mansion, but you'll at least have your most basic material needs met. And here were people who were working not one job, but multiple jobs sometimes, and it still wasn't enough. And so the ways that the term working homeless, how scandalous that was to me, how that term should be an impossibility in any country, but especially in the richest nation on earth. And so it was that initial shock that led me to want to investigate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Hi. You have both spent your careers writing about hard topics. So you've spent years investigating just heart-wrenching travesties that are only potentially in this administration getting worse. So not to sound glib, seriously, how are you both protecting yourselves from the madness after digging so? How are you keeping yourself from the madness?
Thank you. That's a great question that I think journalists probably don't ask themselves enough. I think when you see someone suffering so much in front of you, the last thing you want to do is think about your own mental health, because you're seeing someone who in most cases has it so much worse than you do. My kids, I think, really helped me get out of the madness. I found that I had a much tougher time when I was doing really high-risk work, in Gaza and Somalia and Iraq and Mexico and so on. And so I feel that I have recovered a lot in the last few years, taking a break from that kind of work. But the biggest thing, I think, and I think all the sort of trauma doctors will tell you this, is you got to take time away from it as well. And that means out of the headspace also. And so I find that when I'm finding what books am I going to read, what shows am I going to, things like that, sometimes I have to just not choose the one that I want to consume because I need to take some time away from it.
Ryan? 10 seconds?
Yeah, I don't think I handled it very well. And it would spill, because I was minimizing the effect of it would just spill out in an ugly way. I would be really short-tempered with my kids, and finally my wife, again, my editor, friends were like, you need to see a therapist. And so that was really helpful, but everything Gianna said too, just really being careful about what I'm letting it, because if we let everything in at once, we will drown.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you both for your work. I really loved both books. Question for Brian. How much did you know about the specific circumstances of Georgia that are outrageous? One of the only states to not have their own eviction moratorium and don't have to tell people before their car's repossessed or before they're evicted. How much of that did you know going into this? And also, you guys both took really different approaches to the transparency you offer in the book and being forthright with your roles in it. How did you both come to those decisions of how to include yourself in the narrative or not?
I'll knock out that one really quick, which is that I did not want to write a first-person narrative, and my agent and the editor at the publisher, all but said that's the only version of this book. And once I kind of started to lean into it and think about it, it was hard because I'm not used to making myself a part of the story. But in the end, I think that they were right, that's the best version of the story.
Right?
Yeah, for me, I actually wanted to make myself part of the story because, again, coming from anthropology, there was this sense that we have to talk about what in academia we call our subject position. We can't hide the fact that I'm a white guy who has all this privilege, and that can't be elided, and my own subjectivity has, and how I'm filtering and the editing all of that has to be part of the texture of the narrative itself. And but it just kind of became clear to me that that would just threaten to take over the whole thing. And it's an imperfect decision that I did make with my editor. Let's err on the side of just giving these families a platform. I don't want to distract from that. I don't want readers to be yeah, it's imperfect. I would love to talk about that messiness, but for the narrative itself, it just seemed important to platform their experiences as much as I could. And to the Georgia question, I didn't know the specifics of the awfulness of what people in Georgia are experiencing, but I think it's just important to constantly come back to as bad as things are in Georgia, it's actually more representative for most of the country than a state like New York, where there are relatively robust tenant protections. Most people in this country are subjected to similar conditions. And so again, I think there's something representative about that, not that what people are reading about in the book is some bizarre aberration.
I'm afraid, since we're live on television, we're out of time. But I do want to ask one last question. What do you want readers to take away? What are we all supposed to do, having read your books?
To me, it's to get out of your comfort zone on these issues. I think we've gotten to a point in America where we think we're right and we only listen to the people around us who agree with us. And with this book, regardless of your position on the death penalty, I try to shake readers out of their comfort zone, as I did myself. And so I would encourage all of us to do that. I think it's a vital part of living in a democracy.
I think empathy is great, compassion is great. I hope this book makes people angry. I hope readers feel a little bit of the rage, the anger that I felt reporting it. I hope some of the anger that I felt is transmitted to the reader in the experience of walking with these families through their journeys. And specifically, I want readers to feel the anger that I felt, that this is what housing has been allowed to become, that we have allowed this precious human resource to be hoarded up and put, so to speak, in a U-Haul truck and then auctioned off to the highest bidder. We have forced millions of people in this country to be flung into what a case manager in the book, Carla Wells, calls the housing hunger games. That is what we have allowed housing to become. That is why we are seeing skyrocketing homelessness. And I just want to be clear, homelessness is a policy choice, but that's good news because it means that other choices can be made to end this madness.
I found myself shaking my head as I read both of your books. Excellent work. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you.